You're listening to Zodiac Speaking, brought to you by AbJack Entertainment. Be sure to check out some of the other great true crime podcasts from this network, including The Murder in My Family, Missing Persons, DNA ID, Beyond Bizarre True Crime, Scene of the Crime, Campus Killings, and Killer Communications. All of these podcasts are available for you to binge on right now, wherever you listen to podcasts. Subscribe where you're listening to this podcast so you don't miss an episode.
This is a Zodiac speaking.
Welcome back to an all-new episode of Zodiac Speaking. This is Mike Morford, and with me today are Ned DeHaan from Black Box Online Radio on YouTube. Zodiac Cipher and Code expert Dave Orenchak is also here. And, we're going to dive into something that's been overdue on the show, and that's exposing all things Alex Baber. Alex Baber, in my opinion, I think, probably in the opinions of most people that know the Zodiac case well, is the latest in a long line of grifters to come along and grip the Zodiac case. They've milked their 15 minutes of fame. They're trying to make a few bucks. They're trying to get a documentary deal before fading away from memory. And Alex is not the first person to do this. Probably won't be the last. We can all remember the Deb Perez's of the world claiming their dad was Zodiac. Then Dennis Kaufman was claiming his stepfather was Zodiac. Then came Gary Stewart claiming that his biological father was Zodiac. And then it was the Seawaters and the Allen Netflix documentary. Then the myth of the Zodiac killer playing on the old Warren theory that there was no Zodiac killer. Then we had the Code Breakers with Gary Post, and on and on. There's probably some that I missed. And I think what I'm trying to say is that everyone has sort of seemed to grift this case for attention over the years, for money and so on. And the more it happens, the more the media gives them a pass. These people come on making these wild claims. They do media tours, they do interviews, they make press releases, they get on TV, and they never face any pushback from the press. And the press sort of just eats this stuff up, puts them right on TV. No vetting of this stuff. I mean, how many times have we seen the headline, Zodiac case solved, only for someone to respond in a comment, wait, wasn't this case already solved? And I think it's been solved dozens of times at this point. But the lowdown is the Zodiac case is not solved, period. It remains open and ongoing. And it seems like every couple of years, a new person or a group of people comes forward with wild claims that they've solved it. They get on TV, they make some money, they get some fame, they get their 15 minutes, and then they fade away before the next grifter comes along. It's sort of like the directions on a shampoo bottle: lather, rinse, repeat. It's grifter after grifter. It's time to start pushing back on this nonsense. So I think those of us that actually know the Zodiac case well, have put in time, studied it, read the reports, or sort of experts in this case, need to push back on this nonsense finally. And that's what we're going to start doing in this first episode, the first of multiple episodes, pushing back on this grift. And I can't do that alone, which is why I have my friends Dave and Ned here to shine a bright light on this nonsense. So again, both of you, thanks for coming on and joining us on this episode.
My pleasure. Thank you, Morph.
It's good to have you both here. And Dave, I want to start with you. It's safe to say that most people that are listening to this show already know who you are, but just in case you have a newbie tuning in or someone who's not familiar with your work, can you just give a little bit of brief background for yourself and how you came to be involved in the Zodiac case?
Sure. So I've been doing software development and computer programming pretty much all my life. So that's kind of my, professional experience. And around 2007, when the David Fincher Zodiac movie came out, that's when I learned about the 340 cipher, the Zodiac's 340 cipher, which had been a kind of infamous unsolved cipher that attracted a lot of attention from people over the years. And I got hooked on it too, just like many other people did, and spent, 14 years working on it on and off with different experiments and building up my knowledge about the case and about the Zodiac ciphers, and so forth. And in 2020, when the pandemic was hitting and everyone was on lockdown, one of my uh, uh, pastimes was to start a YouTube channel about what I had learned about the Zodiac ciphers and the case and everything, and just to talk about the different things that I had discovered along the way, and to post some presentations that I had given in the past at various uh, uh, cryptography conferences about the Zodiac ciphers. And by episode 5, some experiments that I had been doing with some friends of mine actually panned out, and we ended up solving the 340 cipher. So by episode 5 of my YouTube series, we had kind of gotten to the the climax of the story a little too early, and we had our almost like a season finale kind of event happen. So that was pretty exciting, and so I've kind of been involved in the case, for all these years, and continue to be even after that breakthrough.
And you are, a proven expert on this stuff. You have a track record, you have a resume to say, hey, we really did solve this. It's been acknowledged by, law enforcement versus some of these other people that come along and every week I get an email, hey, I solved this code. And, I see Facebook post, I solved this code. And, a lot of times it's just people putting out nonsense. They don't know what they're doing, or they're going down a rabbit hole. You actually have the chops to do this stuff and a proven track record. So that's why I think it's important uh, for you to discuss this stuff when you can. But and going into the videos, I know you primarily started off doing cipher and code related stuff, not just on the Zodiac case, other cases too. But in this latest series, this expose, if you will, that you're doing, you're really going into a deep dive and sort of pushing back on these claims. And you're bringing receipts. That's what I really like. So tell us about this latest video series that you're doing, in your words, what it's about, why you're doing it, and what you've found.
Sure. Yeah. So, just to give a little bit of context, my history with the case has been to try to look at people's claims about what they think they've discovered in the Zodiac ciphers in their own code breaking attempts, and other ways that they can extract messages from the Zodiac's communications, like in the letters, the non encrypted material. People are able to um, generate information from those. And so over the years, I'd come to develop this skill of basically analyzing the claims and then trying to figure out if they stand up to peer review, if they use like if they use sound cryptographic methods that can be reproduced, and most importantly, if the result that they've found is unique and no other plausible solution can come out of their decryption. So my videos, a lot of my videos are about those kinds of claims from people, especially when they end up in the news. You mentioned the case breakers, and they had some code related claims involving anagrams that were used to produce messages that they were claiming were from their suspect, Gary Francis Post. And that's a pretty representative example of what's been happening over the years, where they'll develop a suspect and then they come up with all these ways to make their suspect's name or other information appear out of these communications from the Zodiac killer. And so, fast forward to Alex Baber. He had been kind of on the periphery of the case for several years. I had seen him here and there, and I'd always been a little bit suspicious of his approach. And last year, he started messaging me about his current claims, which involve the suspect Marvin Margolis, who was connected to the Black Dahlia case. He was Elizabeth Short's roommate for a brief time. And what Alex was trying to do was to get me involved with vetting his Z13 solution. So he had developed a decryption of the Z13 cipher, and this was before anything hit the news. What he was telling me at the time was that he had gotten all this law enforcement involvement with his findings, not only the decryption of the cipher text, but also some evidence that he had developed or discovered. And he wanted me to sign an NDA, which is what a lot of people who develop solutions like to do because they want to protect this like nugget of information that they've developed that they think is uh, a breakthrough in the case, or they're trying to sell a book or something and they don't want the information to get out too soon. So he tried to get me to sign an NDA. I didn't sign it because I don't review Z13 solutions under an NDA. If you have a solution to the cipher, then just put it out there for the cryptographers to peer review. Um, so that kind of went on for a while. And then eventually in December of last year, the Daily Mail and the LA Times posted those stories about this big breakthrough that Alex had developed, where he had connected the Zodiac killer case and the Black Dahlia case with this guy, Marvin Margolis. So somehow this guy, Marvin Margolis, is the mastermind behind both of these cases. And so my interest in that at first was, okay, I'll do what I usually do. I'll just make a video about the code breaking claims. Whatever evidence that he has that's not code related, I'll let other people deal with that because my expertise is in the code breaking. And so that's where I started with my research for the videos. But it kind of spiraled from there because, I started looking at the non-crypto evidence. He's got some other evidence like the handwriting samples, the sketch that his suspect created in the 90s before he died, the bayonet that supposedly was used at Lake Berryessa by Zodiac, and so forth. And the more I looked at that stuff, the more I found problems with the evidence. And then, most importantly, when I started looking into Baber's background, I found a lot of problematic history. And he had a long run of telling a different story about his investigation where he had two suspects involved. He had Lawrence Kane and Marvin Margolis working together, not only to perpetrate the Zodiac killer and Black Dahlia crimes, but dozens of others, up to 107 homicides in total, in cases like the Atlanta killer, the Atlanta child murders, the OCCK, the lipstick murders, the DC freeway phantom, the killing of Lindy Sue Beekler, the disappearance of Mara Murray, all these cases that are kind of like prominent cases. He was using them to kind of like promote his investigation into these two guys. And since about about 2020 or so, he had been developing some attention on this theory and getting interviews with local news outlets and different like online outlets that were promoting his stories. And he was getting interest in getting these documentaries made about his investigation. And eventually those kind of all fell apart because of some, uh, problematic behavior on his part, namely that he tells a lot of stories and a lot of it's not verifiable, or he basically just, he, he demands that you trust him because he does have the receipts somewhere that support his claims. He
And
was saying,
let me pause you there.
yeah,
So he supposedly has receipts, quote, somewhere.
yeah.
But up to this point, I just want to recap to where you're at so far. So he reaches out to you, NDA. He wants to have sort of exclusive rights to this. He wants you to do some work to help him, but he doesn't want it public. You don't want to do that. He goes forward without having his stuff vetted by you or anyone else, goes forward, starts making these media claims, and along the way has ever-changing stories, including a second suspect, Lawrence Kane. Is that up to this point, that's everything that he's doing, but you're gonna uncover more, is that right?
Yeah, that's pretty much it.
Okay.
To be to be clear, in in his recent push for the stories coming out in December, what made his story more palatable to people was that he managed to convince two former LAPD homicide detectives, as well as three former NSA cryptographers, to endorse his investigation. So they're out in public saying this guy's got irrefutable evidence. This guy, Ed Giorgio, the former NSA guy, he's all over the place saying, this guy belongs on the Mount Rushmore of code breakers for his achievement in deciphering the Z13. I mean, that's a pretty good endorsement, to get. I mean, these are legit NSA guys that are saying Alex has done something no one else has been able to do by developing this solution to Z13 that's connected to all this other evidence that proves beyond the shadow of a doubt that Marvin Margolis has committed is responsible for these two crimes. And, the previous version of his investigation of his stories, involved the two guys, Lawrence Klein and Marvin Margolis. And he kept pushing for these documentaries, and he was doing it again more recently when he got these press releases and news outlets to report on his investigation. And there's all this drama around those documentaries. He had one that was set up and that was actually filming him, but he butted heads with the people running that, and that fell apart. And he's gone off to some other production company, and I don't know what that status is at this point. I would be surprised if they were still working with him, because he's a very difficult person to work with because of his history of deceptions and misrepresentations that are all documented for everyone to see.
Ned, why don't you chime in and maybe talk about whatever questions you have now about what Dave's talked about to this point?
Well, hello, Morph, and thank you for having me. My name is Ned DeHaan, also known as Black Box Ned. I am the host of Black Box Online Radio on YouTube, and every Monday I do an episode about the Zodiac Killer called Zodiac Monday. Now, I didn't start out as a person who focused on the Zodiac Killer mystery. I called my channel Black Box Online Radio as opposed to the Zodiac Podcast. But I found that by 2020, 3 years into my show, people were just demanding more and more about the Zodiac Killer. They wanted to hear more and more about the Zodiac Killer, different perspectives on the case, as well as different insights and hypotheses and theories, and also people who were responding to them. And as someone who regularly follows the news related to the Zodiac Killer mystery now, something enormous happened in 2020, and that is that David Oranchak, Errol Van Eyck, and Sam Blake solved the 340 cipher. It was a monumental discovery. And as somebody who was on the sidelines and in the audience, I just was absolutely ecstatic because it meant we were actually getting closer to solving the Zodiac Killer mystery. So full credit goes to them. But as we can see, there are a lot of developments that happen in the course of Zodiac research, and also people will be putting things out into the news. They want to have that same experience, and they want to use the ciphers to create that experience. And the question for David would be that in your third video, you talked about how you had a personal history with Alex Baber, correct? And that is that, firstly, he disputed the solving of the 340 cipher, and he tried to negate your solution to the 340 cipher and said that he had solved it first. And he thought it was very odd and suspicious that your solution would get all of this publicity, meaning that they signed off on your solution to the 340 cipher as a distraction or to divert attention away from him. And ultimately, that was calling you a fraud. Did I understand all that?
Yeah, that pretty much covers what happened. He had reached out to me prior to the Z340 solve. I don't remember exactly what he was messaging me about. I suspect that it was about his own um, proposed solutions to the various ciphers. He had, in his words, he had solved all four of them, meaning he had solved the 340, the Z13, Z32, as well as the last 18 unsolved characters of the 408 cipher, which as we know, it's like gibberish based on the Hardin's key. No one knows what those last 18 characters mean, if anything. And so around that time period, around I don't know, say October 2020, he was building himself up towards these interviews with People Magazine and working on a documentary with some partners. And so he had this big overarching theory about Lawrence Klein and Marvin Margolis, who he wasn't publicly naming Margolis at the time, but he referred to him by his initials, MS. And Alex had found Lawrence Kane, also known as Lawrence Kane. He had found his name in the various ciphers. And then come December 2020, we made our discovery and actually found the real solution for the 340. And as soon as Alex saw the news reports of that, he became immediately either suspicious or upset by it, because he had in October, just a few months prior, he was on a YouTube live stream where he was describing part of his Z340 solution. So we had some kind of anagram-based thing where he came up with some plain text out of the 340, and he was presenting part of that on the show. So from his perspective, to have the solution come out 2 months later and have it hit the news, he probably felt that in a negative way, and he had posted on Twitter some frustration about that, and it was a very suggestive post about, like, maybe we had taken his information and taken his solution from him. And as I show in the video, there's a clip of him from a 2021 interview with People Magazine, where he was basically suggesting that he had sent me the material and that's what we had gotten the attention for with our solution. I think he didn't really understand what really was going on there. But both he and his wife at the time basically claimed that we had stolen the solution from him.
So, it's an interesting transformation, and I didn't realize that he was been around the scene that long. But the fact that he reaches out to you, wants sort of your, approval to help sell this theory or this story that he's got, you don't agree with him, then you ultimately do solve it, and he sort of pushes back and bends to say that, you're, up to something nefarious yourself, and he's sort of questioning your credibility, when meanwhile he's the one that's, not peer reviewing any of this stuff. And, when somebody doesn't agree with his thing, he's getting angry. So I think that's pretty telling about the kind of person we're dealing with here.
Yeah, and when he was approaching me more recently to get my help for his recent code-breaking claims, he told me that he never tried to solve the 340. Like, he messaged me, and I show that in the video. I mean, he tried to tell me that, he never claimed to solve the 340, and that was obviously wrong, because I have the receipts. He did say, both on the live stream that he did in October 2020, he described the 340, and he was just on record in an interview talking about having solved or having worked on the 340 and sending some of that information to me. So when you find somebody like that who's won't own up to things that they've said in the past like that, and it's so obvious, it poisons the rest of their claims, because, okay, what else is he not telling the truth about, or what else is he not owning up to from his past? And that kind of gets into what the final part of my video series gets into.
Yeah, your videos, as I mentioned, they sort of bring the receipts, and just from the cipher and code standpoint, that part of your videos and what you talk about. And again, I want everyone listening to go over and check out Dave's videos because they're awesome. But just if you can give a synopsis as far as the codes and ciphers themselves, where does he fall short? Are there issues with his work that he's done on the ciphers, in your opinion? Or is he just flat out making stuff fit or just making stuff up? Where do you stand? Where do you come down on his actual work with the cipher portions?
So on if you look at it at face value, what you see is a decipherment method that can be justified as a substitution and a transposition. And those are the two ingredients in the 340s solution, which was validated, which was verified by the FBI and other cryptographers. So it's plausible, it's believable that the Z13 could be similar, a similar scheme where you have to do a transposition and then a substitution. So that's what his solution does. Is he does a grid-based arrangement of the 13 characters and then applies a substitution key, and it produces the name Marvin Merrill. The problem with it that I found is that, like most solutions for the Z13, you can produce other names using the exact same method. So his argument for supporting the solution, which is something repeated by Ed Giorgio, the lead guy of the three NSA guys who endorsed his solution, their argument is that, well, all the other evidence is pointing to this guy, Marvin Merrill. So if we believe that that evidence is irrefutable, undeniable, then that stands to reason that the Marvin Merrill name in the Z13, the way they found it, has to be right, just because everything else is right. So you kind of have to assume that they've got the right guy in the first place before you can accept their argument that the Z13 cipher is right. And that's the same argument that everyone else has been making. Not everyone else, but a lot of people have made the same arguments like, well, my suspect is better than all the others, so the way I found his name in the cipher has to be the right one. But it doesn't really work that way, because you still have to prove that that was the solution that was designed by that suspect, because there's a chance that the name is still appearing by chance, even if you do have the right guy. So those are the issues that I explore in the first video, which is a combination of, the cipher is so short, you can make a lot of other things appear. There's also this assumption that it has to be someone's real name that is the answer to the Z13 cipher, because the letter says, my name is, and it has a blank line, and then it's followed by the ciphertext. So it stands to reason that he might have put his name there. But knowing Zodiac, based on his first two ciphers, he didn't give any identifying information. There's nothing useful at all in those plain texts. He's basically just bragging about his crimes and getting away with them. So there's all these possibilities in what the plain text for Z13 can be, and Alex, as well as his NSA friends, they don't consider any of them except for the possibility that it's a real name of a real person. So that's just a sampling of the issues there.
Now, does that come down to them not understanding how the whole cipher process works and just saying, hey, his name's there, it's got to be him?
I would say with some people that's the case. If you talk to Ed Giorgio, what he will try to do is he will try to use what's known as a Bayesian probability theory or Bayesian statistics to set up a mathematical framework that proves that the solution is very unlikely to be wrong. But it's all based on what he calls prior probabilities. In Bayesian statistics, you set up these assumptions basically, like if these certain things are true, then you can calculate a probability that your conclusion is true. But his prior probabilities, his prior conditions, are based on things like, there's no way Alex could have gotten the wrong guy, because I believe his evidence is right. I believe that, he did find the murder weapon, the bayonet from Lake Berryessa, and it belonged to Marvin Margolis. He found the Marvin's sketch of, supposedly it's a depiction of Elizabeth Short, and it has these markings on it that appear to be references to her wounds and the injuries that she sustained. And all the other things about the bathtub and the Zodiac motel and all this other stuff. Ed buys into all of that. So that gets baked into his mathematical analysis. So from the surface, it looks like, okay, this guy's got a mathematically supported cryptanalysis of Alex's work, but it's all based on these flawed assumptions.
So they're sort of coming to an overall conclusion based on the totality of everything in their minds of what they believe to be true and saying, hey, his name's there on top of all this other stuff. And any suspect's name that appears in the cipher using that method, if it appears there, is it's certainly interesting. But, to just ignore the fact that 1,000 other names can be there too is a problem because, if your suspect's name is there, great. But what about the other 999 names that might be there?
Yeah, and as you know, the suspect pool, we have a very, big suspect pool for the Zodiac case and a lot of familiar names in the Zodiac sleuth community. But it could be that none of them are Zodiac, and it could be an unfamiliar name. If if the case ends up being solved, it could very well be an unknown person, like we experienced with the Golden State Killer. Like nobody knew that that guy was possibly on the radar for those crimes. So we still have to consider that possibility for the Zodiac case. And to exclude names that we're unfamiliar with that can fit in Z13 is a mistake.
So one part of your video series is obviously doing the codes and ciphers, but then you said it went beyond that and you started saying, hey, this is a problem, this is problematic. It seems like the more you dug, the more you uncovered. Tell us about more of the videos and how they evolved and how your investigation into Baber evolved as well.
Yeah, so that it kind of spiraled out of control because I started with the code breaking aspect of it, which is typically it's just a intellectual exercise. Like it's like doing a bit of homework to figure out, okay, what works and what doesn't, and to try to explain the mechanics behind all the different moving parts in their decryption process and try to explain that to people. That part is what I'm used to doing. And then I decided, okay, I'll look into some of the evidence too. And so I started looking at the main bits of evidence, the bayonet, the sketch, where they have issues with putting the guy in certain locations. They don't have really good leads into placing the guy in the Bay Area, at any of the Zodiac crimes. Um, and they also, Alex puts out this picture of Marvin Margolis from, I think it was taken in the 50s. So long before the Zodiac crimes. And he doctored the image to put glasses on him and to kind of change the expression on his face, as well as his hairline and his hair, the hairstyle, so that it would look more like the composite sketch. And of course, when he puts out this press release packet to all these news agencies, he's putting out this picture of Marvin Margolis that everyone looks at and goes, "Wow, he really does look like the Zodiac sketch." Well, of course, I mean he's doctored it to make it look more like the sketch. So that's one of the issues with the evidence. But the real overarching problem, you know, which is independent of the quality of his evidence, is that the more you look into Baber's background himself, the more problems that you find because he has a history of avoiding responsibilities. He can't hold a job. He has a legal history. Um, I've got at least 20 sources and witnesses that speak to his character and describe him as a manipulator and an abuser and just a whole slew of, really awful things. And the more I dug into that, the more the story kind of shifted from analyzing the code, analyzing the evidence, all that shifted more into like investigative journalism. So I kind of went into investigative journalism mode. I'm not an investigative journalist, but I wanted to find out more about, okay, well, what's this guy's, if you hire an investigator to work on your case, like let's say you're family member of a victim of one of these crimes, and you hire an investigator, you need to be able to trust them and you need to know what their background is. You don't just take them at their word about like their credentials. And he has a long history of puffing himself up. You know, he calls himself an autodidact polymath with a high IQ. Um, he says he has all this experience of learning things on his own to build up his knowledge about forensic science and detective work and all this stuff. There's stories from people who knew him. They claim that he used to tell stolen valor stories, like saying that he was in the special forces and had military experience that he doesn't really have. So there's this all this mess and drama around his life. And every active law enforcement member, a detective, a police officer, an FBI agent, has to go through the most basic background check in order to do their job because they're trusted with important information and they can't just go around doing whatever they want. Alex is trying to present himself as an investigator, as a cold case consultant, and he's trying to get people to trust him about his story. But if you look into his past, you'll see a lot of the things that I uncovered in my video, in my part 3 of my series.
Well, I think with his so-called credentials, he'd probably fit right in with the case breakers. I wonder if they have any openings on their team for Alex to come on board. I'm curious, Ned, what are your thoughts? About what Dave's talking about?
Well, I also want to be very clear that it seems like Alex Weber has a long history of lying and saying things that are untrue. Now, I want to share the story and the information as I learned it, and I would love David's response to this. Of course, in December of 2025, we had Alex Weber contacting the news media, particularly the LA Times and the Daily Mail, and the story goes out. And of course, I'm somebody who follows the news as well as Morph. And you start to see these things. Well, okay, who's this Marvin Margolis guy? He's a new suspect on the Zodiac radar. And then one of the first things we see is that, oh, yes, the photo has been doctored. Just as Dave said, the glasses have been superimposed, the hairline was changed. But another thing that came to my attention, like on day number 2, I was contacted by somebody with the initials TM who runs the Lawrence Kane WordPress. I believe he's featured in David's video also on it with that name. And the story that was shared with me was that Marvin Merrill was not found in the Zodiac ciphers. Alex Weber did not learn the name Marvin Merrill from the Zodiac killer Z13. There was no AI decryption. That was all just either made up or not exactly what happened because for a long time, Alex Weber was trying to make the case that it was Marvin Margolis and Lawrence Kane working together. So he contacted TM, who is a researcher who specializes in Lawrence Kane. And TM was the person who found the name Marvin Merrill in the records. Marvin Margolis was born in 1925 with the name Marvin Skipton Margolis, and he adopted the alias Marvin Merrill later on in life. And TM discovered that in 2019, then provided that name, the alias. He provided the alias to Alex Weber. So this whole thing about the AI decryption, oh, I learned the name Marvin Merrill by solving the Z13, it's my understanding that that just never happened. And David, how was your interpretation of the events?
Yeah, that's pretty much it. When I was first looking into this, so you're right. He was in the news reports from the Daily Mail, the LA Times, telling this story about about how he spent 9 months going through millions of names that could fit the ciphertext, and that's just based on the letter frequencies. You know, there's certain letters that repeat, and so that restricts the pile of possible names, and it doesn't restrict it by much if you include transposition. That's why he starts with millions of names. That's how many that can fit. And then the story he tells is that he went through this exhaustive process using AI, and he comes up with these other kind of jargon terms to decorate his story, like machine learning progressions or C++ reductions. You know, he just throws out these phrases without showing any evidence of the process. He just tells it. And he says that the names he gradually reduced not only with this AI thing, but like cross-referencing the names against this database of names, this huge database of names, and comparing the Zodiac profile against profile information for these names. And somehow he's got, this magical data that can link all these names to their, profile, like their ages and their race and their location and all this stuff. And then, he adds a little bit of flair to the story, and he'll say, "Oh, I got it down to 30 names, and I got it down to 14 names, and then finally one name, Marvin Merrill." And then he's on record, he's on camera being asked, "When you found that name, what did it mean to you?" And he says, "Nothing. I don't know who this guy is." And then he says in another interview that in 2024, he had discovered who the son of his suspect was once he started learning about who Marvin Merrill was, and then arranged a meeting with the son under false pretenses. And he says this was in 2024. But as you say, Ned, the other Zodiac researcher, TM, I had discovered one of his comments on a YouTube video that was about Alex Baber. And he said that he had reached out to him that Alex had reached out to him for some help in researching Marvin Margolis. So I was really interested in that. So I talked to TM. He sent me the emails. So I have screenshots of the emails where Alex was like, "Hey, I've got this guy I'm interested in. He's possibly connected to Black Dahlia. His name's Marvin Margolis. I don't know much about him other than this little bit of information. Can you help me?" 5 days later, and this was towards the end of 2019, 5 days later, TM had found some more information about him, some of his vital stats, like his birth date and where he was living and things like that, as well as the fact that by the time he died, he had an alias, Marvin Merrill. And the death record has both of the names on it, Marvin Margolis as well as Marvin Merrill. So I have those emails from 2019 that demonstrate that Alex knew who Marvin Margolis and Marvin Merrill were from 2019. But that's not the story he told on the Daily Mail, on the LA Times, on the Hamptons Whodunit panel, where the Daily Mail orchestrated this event at a crime fiction convention in the Hamptons. There was the Impact Nightline documentary that they had gotten made, where they interviewed Alex and talked about his claims. And in there, he was talking about, narrowing down the names from millions down to this guy, Marvin Merrill, who he had no idea, what this name was. So it's very clear that he's misrepresenting himself with that story.
Exactly what I think happened, and I'm not a psychic. I'm not a mind reader. I don't know what's in anybody's heart and soul. But what it appeared to me is that when he was talking about finding the name Marvin Merrill from the Z13 cipher, the Z13 does match up to Marvin Merrill when you unscramble it. Not in a single sequence, absolutely not. But there are certain amounts of characters, like you have the 3 R's and the 2 L's, you can get the name Marvin Merrill. But for a very long time, Alex Baber was not pushing Marvin Merrill or Marvin Margolis as his Zodiac suspect. He said that there was this team of Lawrence Kane and Marvin Margolis working together. And somebody even asked me this question. They said, why didn't he just write a book about Marvin Margolis as a Black Dahlia suspect? Just say, "Oh, well, he's my suspect in the Black Dahlia case." And the one thing we haven't really talked about too much is Marvin Margolis was a real suspect in the Black Dahlia case who was heavily, heavily considered. He's one of the original suspects in the murder of Elizabeth Short. That's how he gets pulled into all of this. But Alex Baber took it a step further, and he wanted to look at this team of Lawrence Kane and Marvin Margolis working together. And once he learned that he could get Marvin Merrill out of the Z13 cipher, he didn't need the team anymore. He's like, "Oh, I can establish my Zodiac killer presentation without talking about Lawrence Kane at all." And then he can be the first one to accuse Marvin Margolis Merrill of being the Zodiac and have the Zodiac Black Dahlia connection. And it's like finely tuning the narrative to make it more palatable to the general public. He's like, "Oh, I can fit Marvin Merrill into the cipher now. Well, let's see what other connections that I have." Well, he didn't really live in Vallejo or San Francisco or Benicia, California. He had a house in San Jose, California. His second home was in San Jose. That's close enough, right? And then working all of these things to try to make the narrative fit. So what I believe happened is once he obtained the name Marvin Merrill from TM, who again, Marvin Merrill was not Alex Baber's initial discovery. He did not even discover the name himself. That was found by somebody else. Once he had that, he's like, all right, now I'm going to work this into a Zodiac Black Dahlia connection, and then people are going to like it a lot more. And if anything, it became a lot more popular. That's all.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you. It sounds like what's an easier sell, that there's a mystery team of 2 guys running around doing this, or if he can just sell it on one guy and not have to fit the second guy into it, it seems like that's an easier sell to sell that story. What's your take, Dave?
Yeah, the other thing that plays into all that, like that's all probably right. The the other factor that I think might be at play is around when he was still thinking about his 2-person murdering team as Elon Green. Elon Green is a reporter. He wrote about Faber's claims. He called Marvin Margolis the LeBron James of murder. So that I kept thinking of that with like this LeBron James team of like superhero killers. They're just able to be in all these different places in time and space and commit these crimes. Anyway, Lawrence Klein happened to be the suspect that was developed by Faisal Ziraoui, the French Moroccan engineer who got a lot of press in the spring of 2021. So he had gotten involved in the case after the 340 solution, made the rounds in the news, and he was inspired to work on the Z13 and Z32 ciphers, and he came up with stuff that implicated that Lawrence Kane. He was using his other alias Kane for that. And so those articles were coming out around the same time. So that might have influenced whether he wanted to keep going with Klein, because the novelty of the story is no longer it's not as easy to sell because it's just talking about the same suspect basically. And so he might have had to refine it because of that.
That line, LeBron James of murder, that's a great line. There's a lot of support for Alex Baber, but there's also some pushback, and I know in some of your videos you touch on some of the people that have pushed back. I wanna see if you can touch on some of those sources that have sort of hit back and said, "No, this is, you gotta call him out on this." What are some of those sources that you featured in your videos?
So the first ones were, the people who were public about it. Obviously he did not make a good impression with anyone who knows anything about the Zodiac cases or even the Black Dahlia people. Um, they didn't think much of um, his solutions. Although Marvin Margolis makes a better suspect for the Black Dahlia case than the Zodiac case, but I digress. Um, Elon Green, as I mentioned, he wrote an article for Defector, and basically called out Michael Connolly and Baber for pushing this story, which is uh, hard to believe and is somewhat irresponsible to be pushing as if they had actually solved the cases. And then there's a Bay Area journalist named Martha Ross who wrote an article similarly critical of Baber and his claims. And part of the reason she wrote that was because Michael Connolly and the 2 ex-cops, well, actually 3 ex-cops, and Alex were doing a fundraiser for a nonprofit foundation called the Eugene O'Neill Foundation. And they were selling the event as, hey, look, we solved these famous cases. Come watch us talk about it, and they'll raise money for the foundation. And Martha was reporting on that because, obviously that's um, a bold claim to make that these guys have actually legitimately solved these cases. And that's the draw for the event, is that this idea that they've actually solved anything. So that was the initial pushback. What I found in my investigation was, you know, the history of him taking people's research, such as from TM, as we discussed, all of that Zodiac research. He had done a bunch of stuff to dig up information about Lawrence Klein, aka Lawrence Kane, as well, and no doubt that Alex had relied on that information as well. And evidently, Alex got a lot of his Black Dahlia case information from George Hodel, who's famous for, which is which? The son, Steve Hodel.
Steve Hodel is the son.
Yeah, Steve. Thanks, man. So Steve Hodel was contacted by Alex, and the same kind of thing. Alex praised him for his research and got him to share information with him, and then kind of ghosted him without crediting him, which is the experience that TM had. So there was this pattern of he's just taking and not giving back. So that's one thing that I started to find. And then there were stories popping up in YouTube comments from people who purported to know the guy, like people that might have lived with him or lived near him or were friends of him or his wife. And they were telling these disturbing stories about him being a manipulative con man, having a drug problem, money problems, stealing money from people, and just being generally untrustworthy. So I started to reach out to these people and found quite a few of them that testified against him to me, and saying that they saw him do these things, that they watched him tell stories about claiming to be in the special ops and, trying to gain sympathy for some of the negative experiences in the military, that he manipulated his ex-wife, that he was abusive, that he was stealing money from not only her, but there's other women that he was associated with that people have said that he's been stealing from them or had been stealing from them as well, and just kind of goes from victim to victim to try to deal with his money problems. And that was the other thing that turned up, was if you look into his history, you can go into the court record searches, the ones that are public, and find that he has very many cases of not being able to pay his bills or pay his rent, and the creditors coming after him in court. So they'll file these cases, and very often Alex wouldn't even show up to court. You can look, it's public records. You can see that the judges would rule for the plaintiffs in those cases because of Alex not showing up. They call it judgment by default. So they just give it to the plaintiff. And then the dockets will show this rigmarole of the court trying to get him to pay, and they're not able to serve him the documents from the court, like they can't find his current address or something. And they'll have these problems like they'll try to garnish his wages from his employers. And that's the whole other rabbit hole, is trying to find out his previous employment. Because if you're trying to investigate the background of somebody trying to be an investigator, you want to see what other jobs they've had. Evidently, he was a car salesman, but he caused a lot of problems for the dealerships he was working for. And, one of them, at least one, actually maybe two of them, brought him to court. And the more I talk about this, the more is coming into my mind. There's just so much. The more you look at it, the more you find. Like, there was another comment about him working for a place called Austin's Beauty College. This was when he lived in Tennessee with his ex-wife. And he was hired to work at this beauty college. It's like a cosmetology school where people enroll and learn how to do hair and makeup and all that. He was doing admissions, evidently. He was only there for a few months because he immediately struck the owner as being untrustworthy. And I talked to the owner. The owner's telling me these things. I'm not making this stuff up to kind of tarnish his reputation or anything like that. All you have to do is talk to people that have dealt with him in his past, and they'll tell you these things. She told me that he was stealing. She couldn't trust him with money, that he was stealing from the business. And she had to fire him after a few months. And she said other things like he was a womanizer. He would lie to the women to get them interested in him, and all this nonsense and drama. And there's a one of the car dealerships that he evidently worked for, who had taken him to court. The owner told me personally to be cautious about this guy because he's untrustworthy. He's a manipulator. He engages in fraud. He hasn't been able to hold a job in the time that this person knew him. So all of these stories are kind of reinforcing each other. It's one thing if it comes from one person saying that, you know, giving these character witness testimonies, but when you have, the number of people that I have talking about this, that they haven't even met each other, and they're saying very similar things about his character. If I was a background investigator, this would be immediately a red flag, that this guy is wrong for whatever job that you're trying to hire him for. And the upsetting thing about this is that it didn't take much work to uncover this stuff. And none of the news outlets, the Daily Mail, the Daily Mail, they're known for publishing bullshit. They kind of have a reputation for it. They've gotten libel lawsuits over it. They can't even be used as a source on Wikipedia. They're banned from being used as a source on Wikipedia. Okay, so that's the Daily Mail. The LA Times picked up this story, and they're somewhat credible news outlet. In fact, the guy who wrote the article, Chris Goffard, he has a Pulitzer Prize for some of his reporting. So this guy's like a legit journalist, and he didn't find any of this stuff about the guy he was writing about. So why am I the one picking this stuff up? Why aren't these journalists picking up this stuff about him? Why aren't these ex-cops picking up this stuff about him? Why is he being allowed to go and meet with active law enforcement, which is something that he's done? And he goes in and he tells these stories to actual cops. And elements of his stories are just straight up misrepresentations, like the ones that we've already talked about. The way that he found the name, the one of the other ones that I haven't mentioned yet that's in the video is where he claims to meet the son for the first time in 2024, but he's on video in 2021 saying that he had the suspect's son's cooperation then. So he's going into these active law enforcement agencies, telling them these stories. Elements of the stories are probably fabrications. So he's wasting his investigative resources. He's doing false reporting, right? Because he's talking to active law enforcement and giving them information that's not accurate. And he knows that it's not accurate. So, I mean, that's a crime, isn't it? So the more you look into this guy, the more it turns into like, this is a serious problem. We have to call him out because no one else is, doing anything about it. And he's just going to go find some other way to victimize people that aren't as familiar with a case or that don't know about his history and so forth. So
Definitely paints a picture. And we have to put the caveat out there that some of this stuff is secondhand information, some of it unverified, but you get enough sources, it does paint a picture. And, one of the things you mentioned, stolen valor, if that's accurate, that's a crime, so not a good picture overall of this person who seems, and I'm just going to say my opinion, I think he's a snake oil salesman, a con artist is what I think, It'd be one thing if he was, someone that truly believed he was on the right path and just sort of had blinders on, but this seems like a case of, I'm just going to hype this guy up, make this stuff up, and get my 15 minutes and cash out. That's my opinion. But you bring up a good point. He's got some people bought into this. He's got seasoned police investigators, detectives in his corner. He's got an established, well-known author that is had a podcast about this stuff. How has he been able? Is he just conning these people? Or are they just buying in without knowing all this stuff? And I'm curious, have any of these people that he's brought in, have they now had a change of heart to your knowledge after maybe some of the stuff you and others have uncovered?
I don't have any official confirmation of anyone changing their minds as far as like Michael Connolly and we call him Team Baber. So it's Alex, it's Michael Connolly, it's the ex cops Rick Jackson and Mitzi Roberts, and they had this guy David Tresmonton, another former detective. They were all endorsing the guy. Um, as far as I know, none of them have said anything publicly about retracting anything or even changing their minds about it. But I suspect if they have changed their minds at all about any of this, well, there's kind of uh, I would call it what do they call it? Foreshadowing. There's a little bit of foreshadowing of this in an article with Michael Connolly when he was interviewed about Alex Baber's claims. He says that in that article, which was long before I made the videos, he said, Alex Baber, he rubs people the wrong way. He goes out there, he says things that, piss people off, and he rubs me the wrong way. He was saying that about himself. But he was still going along with the story because Michael Connolly, I don't think, was looking too deeply into the details. That's why he has his consultants, Mitzi Roberts and Rick Jackson. So they're the ones that would look into the evidence that Alex was presenting and kind of vetting. And I guess they liked it, so Michael Connolly liked it, and he went with it. But I think behind the scenes, I I have a hard time not expecting them to have some kind of buyer's remorse at this point. But they've already sunken too much of their reputations and money, in Michael Connolly's case, into this escapade that they would lose a lot of face if they said anything about it. It would be very helpful if they said something about it, because then it would be, not just us on the outside, calling out all of this and, exposing the problem, but it would be, a way of healing if they would go out and say, okay, we were wrong. You've obviously pointed out this guy's got real problems, and that's not a hallucination. These are real issues. Um, but they haven't done that yet, and they need to.
Well,
Yeah.
actually, I would like to take a shot at answering this question about why did so many people attach themselves to this theory? Why was there no pushback? Why was he just given the opportunity to talk to members of law enforcement? And I have to go back in time a little bit because I used to be a very big fan of the Opperman Report hosted by Ed Opperman. And when he would do Zodiac killer interviews, he would always ask the guests, what do you think about George Hodel as a suspect? What do you think about Ed Edwards as a suspect? The George Hodel theory is also a variant of the Zodiac Black Dahlia connection. The Edward Wayne Edwards theory is not only a variant of the Black Dahlia Zodiac connection, but Ed Edwards was accused of 660 murders by John Cameron. And as Dave has already said, Steve Hodel accuses George Hodel of being the Black Dahlia Avenger and the Zodiac Killer. Both of these individuals are former members of law enforcement. John Cameron and Steve Hodel, the proponents of these theories. And I was just sitting back and thinking, why is anyone even asking about these far out ridiculous theories? Well, it's because they are extremely popular. And there is something about this outrageousness that gets people's attention. There is something about this connection between high profile true crime cases that makes people think in very curious ways. It stands out. Maybe it's being outrageous to stand out from the crowd. And members of law enforcement are not immune to that. Former members of law enforcement, former cops, former homicide detectives, which Steve Hodel was, are not immune to that either. So people can still have these types of thought patterns, even if they've worked in these divisions. But once I started doing Zodiac Killer interviews myself, I began to notice that I'm asking those same questions to my guests. Like, what do you think about Ed Edwards as a Zodiac suspect? What do you think about George Hodel as a suspect? What do you think about the Zodiac Black Dahlia connection? Because, again, these ideas are popular, they're outrageous, they're extreme, and people genuinely want responses to that because of how many times they've heard it in the media. So is everything just expanding? And I really think that the people who were working with this team Baber, as Dave just said, perhaps were caught into that storm. They were put under that spell when they've had this very, very far out story of the Zodiac killer and the Black Dahlia Avenger being the same person. And then you can arrange some of the points in a coherent narrative if you don't know any better. If you didn't do the work that Dave did for his videos, if you just hear it, yeah, okay, this guy, Marvin Margolis, he was a Black Dahlia suspect, and then he started using aliases. One of them was Marvin Merrill. He had a house in San Jose. And here's a solution to the Z32 cipher, which deals with Oakland, California. Clearly, he moved north, and then he just started committing murders in a different way because he was 43 years old at the time. If you were to just take the narrative without doing any of the background research, then it might make sense to you. But in short, I think some people got duped by an outrageous story because it caught their attention.
Yeah, and it's along those lines. Those are all good, valid points. And it's one thing for news stories that want clicks to just say, "Hey, the Zodiac case is solved." How many times will the same news outlets run the story "Zodiac case solved" every 2 years? It's like a different. I don't think they care. They just want some clicks. They just want the headline. They don't care if it's true. They don't do any research like Dave's doing. It's just like, "Oh, okay, it's been 2 years. Somebody else solved the case. Let's just publish it and run with it." And 2 years from now, we'll be doing the same thing for somebody else. There's just no accountability from the press. So that's one thing. But for detectives and investigators that have careers and reputations to protect, for them to blindly go down this thing, and we've seen it with the case breakers. A team of, again, I don't really know how qualified the team of the case breakers were, but they're supposedly a big team of experts with impressive resumes. For them to endorse such a flimsy, terrible suspect as Gary Post, it just collectively, it makes me question their abilities altogether about everything. So, and the same in this case, these people that are on Team Baber, you know, what are they doing? How do they not see this and say, "Oh, I think I've made a mistake here"? And everybody makes mistakes. I make mistakes. Both of you make mistakes. Nobody's perfect. So if you recognize, hey, I bought into this. Maybe I got caught up in the hype. Maybe at first it was impressive, but now I see there's things here that don't make sense. It's never too late to come back and say, hey, you know, I originally endorsed what he said, but I'm having problems now with believing it. And, set the record straight. Come out and say, hey, we went down this rabbit hole and now we're putting the brakes on because things don't add up. And I'd love to see some of that from Team Baber at this point.
Okay, but more, if there's one real very quick response before I turn it over to Dave. You asked, how does this work? I have two words for you: persuasion tactics. Because with the case breakers and the organization that is led by Tom Colbert, he used to work for CBS in broadcasting, and they had a very flimsy narrative, but he knew how to craft a press release to get people's attention. And with Alex Baber, it seems like there is a certain element of that going on where he knew what to say to the detectives to get a desired result. Persuasion tactics. Not just saying, oh, look at me, I've solved the Zodiac killer mystery in the Black Dahlia case. No, he was perhaps spending years, if not decades, trying to perfect this type of con artistry. And I think we can use that term now to get them to sign on to this. And Dave has done all of the work, and he has really provided all of the supporting points and examples and documented everything, shows the receipts, and everything that Dave has just said is supporting evidence of that. But he knew what to say. He tried to say the narrative in a very particular way that would get a desired result. And members of law enforcement are not going to be immune to that, nor will the media.
Yeah, in my video, I refer to that as a type of laundering, comparing it to money laundering. You're taking bad money and trying to make it look good, make it look legit. And he's taking bad ideas. Alex is taking bad ideas and laundering them to make them look good. And the way he does it is just like the case breakers did, like these persuasion tactics that you referenced, Ned, is you get these endorsements, you get people involved that add more and more credibility to your story. And then you kind of, it's like a house of cards. Like it looks impressive, and then something comes along later to blow it all down because it's flimsy. It's on a flimsy foundation. It'll be interesting to see what happens next, because the website for Killer in the Code, the podcast that Michael Connolly put together for to talk about Alex Baber's case, his investigation. Supposedly, there's another season coming along. So there's already 10 episodes out for the first season, and there's a link for chapter 11, but there's a thing next to it that says season 2 coming soon, and that's been up there for a while. There was a Facebook feed on it's Michael Connolly's Facebook feed. It's probably not run by him directly. It's probably run by an assistant or something. But somebody was asking there, is when season 2 coming out of Killer in the Code? And whoever runs that account replied sometime in the June, I think. So here we are in June. Maybe we'll have a season 2, but it seems like it'd be unlikely for such a thing to happen. And the only other promotion of this is from Alex himself, who has taken the original logo and like artwork for the show, which is used in the podcast and everything, and he's run it through some AI filter and made it look a little different. And it made Elizabeth Short look like a different person, and made the cipher symbols in the background look like completely different cipher symbols. It changed like the font of the show, and he promoted this as if it's the thing that's happening for sure. That season 2 is coming out this summer or whatever, and so that raises a lot of questions of: is this something that's really truly endorsed by Michael Connolly? Is he really doubling down on this, or is Alex still trying to use his persuasion tactics to keep the interest going for the people who are still supporting him?
I think at this point, the credibility is an issue. You had an example in one of your videos where, Baber's suspect can't be placed in the Bay Area, at all, anywhere close to any of the Zodiac crimes. And he's like, well, the rest of the stuff fits. We don't even need to place the suspect in the area. Wait, and you push back like, what? How do you not have to place a suspect in an area? They at least have to have set foot in the town. And if you can't even prove that they ever did that, how are you going to come out and say this is 100% in my mind solved? What kind of police work is that? I talked to enough detectives that if you can't place a person even in a town at some point, how can you say they definitely committed a crime? You don't have evidence. I don't know how much Baber's claim to have physical evidence, because obviously that's what you need to solve this case. Contrary to popular belief, what Alex Baber will have you believe, this case is not solved. The Zodiac case is wide open, still being investigated, and until law enforcement comes out and says this case is solved and closed, that's going to be the status of it. And they haven't done that because it's not solved. So, barring some kind of physical evidence, which Alex Baber doesn't have Zodiac evidence in his possession to compare to his suspect, until the police do that and announce his case is closed, it's not going to change the aspect of it. It's open. And for these investigators to be 100% convinced in their mind and just say, oh, we don't need to even place a suspect there. It's just, that's mind boggling. And it makes me question their whole resume of work at that point, because to just flat out say, I don't need the guy to be in that town at all. This story just sounds compelling enough to me. I'm sold on him. It just seems foolish.
Well, there are a couple things there, Morph, because in terms of physical evidence, he did come forward and say that possibly he had the bayonet that was used for the Lake Berryessa stabbing. I'm sure you've seen it with the circled 8 on it, and saying that this was possibly the murder weapon that was used to kill Cecilia Shepard. But they were submitting that one for testing and saying that this Nagoya-style Japanese bayonet might have Brian Hartnell's DNA or Cecilia Shepard's DNA somewhere in part of the handle and the hilt or some type of DNA, period. And what I said was, You don't even need me for that. You don't even need somebody to talk about the Zodiac killer in the news if they've submitted it to law enforcement for the testing. And I think the test should speak for themselves. If they find Cecilia Shepard's DNA, then perhaps there's a very high chance that he was the killer. If they don't find anything, then it's not evidence. But he produced a single-sided bayonet, and the reports, though, state that it was possibly a double-sided bayonet that was used to stab Cecilia Shepard. I don't think they were 100% certain on it because it said possibly from a double-sided bayonet. That's a strike against him. And then also, in fairness, as we said, Marvin Margolis, using the name Marvin Merrill, had a house in San Jose, California. That was his second home. It's my understanding that in 1969, at the time of Zodiac activities, he was living in San Diego, but he had this second home in San Jose. Now, to Morph's credit, San Jose and San Francisco, not the same place, no, not at all. But and because we also have the locations of where the Zodiac mailed the letters. And I mean, San Jose is much closer though than some of the other places in California. But no, I agree. There's not a lot of hard evidence.
Yeah, and what they would call the smoking gun in the podcast is the sketch. So presumably Marvin Merrill, on his like a year before he died, had created this sketch of a woman. On the bottom of the sketch, it says Elizabeth, and there are sketch markings on parts of the body of this woman that they say match the autopsy details of Elizabeth Short's injuries. And it's a subjective kind of thing because when you look at it without knowing anything about the case, it just looks like creases or like the decorative lines that just give a little depth to the illustration. But probably the most striking aspect of the sketch that they're putting out there is this hidden signature that was somehow extracted from the sketch. So towards the bottom, in kind of this like darkened, filled in section of the sketch, if you look at it without modifying the photograph, it looks like there's some letters that were colored over in the sketch, and they kind of vaguely resemble letters of the alphabet. You can't read what it says, but what Alex says is that he calls it contrast spectrum layers. That's his phrase. Like he likes to use these kind of jargon phrases to decorate his claims. But he says he used the contrast spectrum layers to peel out the details of the writing underneath, and it looks a little bit like the word Zodiac. But if you look at, for instance, the picture of that he sent to the Daily Mail, you can see like the word contrast on the bottom of the image, which is highly suggestive of just using a phone to adjust the contrast. Like if you have an iPhone, you can see the word contrast when you're editing a photo. So who's to say that he didn't just use the pen tool in the photo editor on the iPhone to just fill in what he thought he saw in the image? Like if you're looking at clouds, you're like coloring in the shapes that you see that aren't really there. We don't know if he did that, but I suspect he did something like that because he will not show anyone how exactly he performed his contrast spectrum layers analysis to pull out the words. Now, the other bit of evidence that I thought of that he's brought up in the past when he was talking about Lawrence Klein, so that was before this modern era of claims. He was making these claims about fingerprint matches. So what he was saying was that he had gotten some fingerprint evidence under the table, quote unquote, that he used some kind of shady tactics to get actual crime scene evidence from someone. And he said that he had purchased it. And the claims that he made was that he had gotten fingerprint evidence from the Chicago lipstick murders. So there was apparently some fingerprint evidence from that case that he says he compared to Lawrence Klein and got a match. He said it was like an 18 or 19 point match. And then he later said in a comment to Destry Hines, the son of what's his name? The detective who developed
Harvey Hines.
Harvey Hines. Thanks. He was talking to Destry Hines on Facebook about matching Lawrence Klein's fingerprints to the Lake Berryessa fingerprints from the Carmen Gia. So he says he's got Lawrence Klein matching both of these bits of physical evidence. But what does he say now about any of this? He doesn't say anything about it.
Now, Lawrence Kane is not involved, according to him. So how does he have prints on there? And if his prints really are on there, how does he not still include them? The story's all over the place.
Yeah, so you can't take him at his word for things.
But there is something, though, that we need to discuss, and it relates to what Dave was saying about the picture. There's this picture of someone, and there's a name, Elizabeth, at the bottom. And this is one of the most frustrating examples of the case, in this case, because when I heard the news, I was like, all right, I'll give it an honest take. You know, Marvin Margolis was 43 years old at the time of the Zodiac murders. That's not really the end of the world. And okay, he's in San Jose. That's not the end of the world either. But when you present this as evidence, that you have a picture of someone named Elizabeth and you're saying, hey, look, he killed the Black Dahlia. The person in the picture looks nothing like Elizabeth Short. I mean, absolutely not. Her hair isn't even done in the same fashion compared to what Elizabeth Short's hair looked like, and her hair looked like the dahlia flower. That's why they called her the Black Dahlia. She doesn't resemble Elizabeth Short at all. But moreover, how is that evidence of someone's guilt in a murder investigation? What on earth does that have to do with murder? Could you bring that into a court of law? Hey, this guy had a picture of a girl named Elizabeth. I mean, they would laugh him out of the courtroom. And secondarily, even if it does say Zodiac and that wasn't, altered, how on earth does that mean that somebody was the one and only Zodiac killer just because they have the name Zodiac written on something? Zodiac was on watches. Zodiac was on cards. Zodiac was on spiritual books. I was just talking about Zodiac messages recently. I mean, just because it says Zodiac, that doesn't mean he was the literal Zodiac killer. And the final point, and I have to give a shout out to YouTube user Trashly who said this. Now, wait a second. This person does not look like Elizabeth Short, but even if that actually is Elizabeth Short in the picture, does that mean that he killed her? No, he knew her personally. That's why he's a suspect in the Black Dahlia case. She spent 12 days in his apartment in October of 1946. She slept on the couch. He was engaged at the time to a woman named Edith Bernstein. Reportedly, he actually did try to do things with Elizabeth Short, and that was he was attempting to do them, but she rejected him, refused. He said nothing happened, and nor did his roommate get anywhere with the other girl they were trying to mess around with, Marjorie Graham. The other roommate was named Bill Robinson. But that just means that, he knew her personally. If you knew somebody who was involved in one of the highest profile murders in the nation's history in the 20th century, if you knew the Black Dahlia victim and you had a picture of her, does that mean that you killed her? I mean, if you have a picture of any murder victim, does that immediately mean that you killed her? No. That is not hard evidence. You want to talk about getting the bayonet tested to see if it has Cecilia Shepard's blood on it? I am all ears. I will wait for your results. I'd be like, okay, you have something. Hey, look, this says Elizabeth on it. Oh, you found a picture of a girl named Elizabeth? Wow. Yeah, that's really going to seal the deal. That's the most frustrating part.
Yeah, and you mentioned Julie Kelly earlier.
Mhm.
They did an episode about that, and they talked about the sketch, and they said the same thing, that they basically said, what if he's just upset by the fact that happened to somebody he knew, and he was just ruminating about it, and when he was making the sketch, that's enough reasonable doubt right there to dismiss that as a piece of evidence in that case.
Doesn't
You
prove
knew
anything.
somebody who was murdered and you have a photo of them. That doesn't mean that you're the killer, especially oh my gosh, that girl Elizabeth that stayed in my apartment. Oh, she got killed. Uh, I mean, I could understand why another human being would want, an image of her like that. But now Dave, you can correct me if I've misstated anything here. The son of Marvin Margolis, Marvin Merrill, came forward and said that Marvin Merrill had a girlfriend later in life named Elizabeth, and he believes that that person is not Elizabeth Short. that is Elizabeth, his girlfriend, like after the divorce and all that, or I shouldn't say divorce, after he was no longer married to Edith, he had a girlfriend named Elizabeth. Do you have the specifics on that?
I don't know the details. I had heard that he had dated somebody named Elizabeth, and
And
when
that's her in the photo.
that is possibly her in the sketch, but I don't know if it has been confirmed. But like Alex will point out when he's faced with that pushback that the image clearly is of a younger woman, and the girlfriend would have been much older than that at the time, as if you know you have to paint the picture of a person as they look now. There's like it's not possible to paint somebody as they looked back then. But even so, it's a contradiction because he's trying to tell you that this is what a picture of Elizabeth Short looked like. Like, obviously, she doesn't look like that anymore, or even at all in the first place. As you pointed out, her hair is completely different, and so forth.
It just backing up. Even if it is Elizabeth Short, it doesn't mean anything. He knew her. That's not a mystery. And maybe that her death impacted him, whether he killed her or not. I mean, it's not physical evidence. I'm all for physical evidence solving the Zodiac case. I want to see it solved. I have my own suspect, and I'm convinced that if physical evidence was able to be found for him and delivered to police, I think it would match. But that being said, I want it to be solved no matter who it was. So if Team Baber had some physical evidence to hand over to police in the Zodiac case to help close this case, I'd be all for it. My suspicion is when it came back and there was no blood on there or didn't match or it ruled out his suspect, then that's the end of the con. The con's over at that point. I just think that for him to give physical evidence over and then it exclude his suspect, exclude his story, then the 15 minutes is up at that point. So I think it sort of behooves him not to move forward with that, something that's going to rule his suspect out because then the con ends.
Yeah, and he's got there's two strategies right now that I'm aware of where where Alex is talking about physical evidence. One of them is the Daily Mail reported about supposedly Alex found a fingerprint card that belonged to Margolis, and he submitted it to active LAPD LAPD detectives. And in the story, they have a quote from the detective. I forget his name, and he's basically saying, we have to consider it, we'll vet it, whatever. But that's one thing that he has, that he says he has, that might be considered physical evidence for the case. Because if they have fingerprints in the Black Dahlia case, maybe they have something that they can compare. The other strategy is there was yet another Daily Mail article, kind of as a follow-on to the Hampton's Whodunit event that the Daily Mail reporters put on with him to talk about his investigation and the latest developments. One of the latest developments was this idea that they were getting some cooperation from family members pertaining to DNA in the case. Now, what DNA is there in the Black Dahlia case to compare it with? I don't know. I'm not familiar enough with the case to know if that's even feasible. But that's what Alex is trying to sell. The interesting thing about that is, it makes me think of, okay, he's probably talking about the son, Marvin Merrill's son, who he claims has been cooperating. But as I've pointed out before, he's been misrepresenting the story about meeting the son, because in 2021, he said he already had the son's cooperation. And even in that interview, he was also saying that once he showed the son his evidence, he was convinced enough to cooperate and to offer his DNA to help close these cases. And this was back when Alex was still talking about the double team, that was responsible for 107 homicides. So even back then, he was trying to sell this physical evidence idea that he could solve the case with DNA using this cooperating son of one of his suspects. And he's repeating the same kind of thing recently with the Daily Mail story about DNA helping with the Black Dahlia case, which nobody has been quoted on except for him. So once again, we rely only on his information.
Well, now, I also don't know what this DNA would be in the Black Dahlia case because Elizabeth Short's body was scrubbed with a coconut bristle brush, and the person went through a very extensive effort to wash off anything that could be left behind. And I mean, it's most likely that she was dismembered in a bathtub, but it could be an operating table, autopsy table, something like that. But I don't know what evidence they would have from the killer, if like everything had been removed from her body and she was found naked in, Southern California and the Los Angeles area. So it's not like the killer left behind his gloves or something like that. And they might have they might have bags or something that the killer used to transport the body, but how would you know that that was actually DNA from the killer as opposed to somebody who touched the bag? And there is one point though that I would just like to share as a side note, and it's not even my observation. It's from Eli Frankel, who wrote the book Sisters in Death about the Black Dahlia case, and that is that the problem with this Marvin Margolis theory is that Marvin Margolis was married to a woman named Edith Bernstein, as I said. They got married in November of 1946. Elizabeth Short disappeared on January 9th of 1947. And what newcomers to the Black Dahlia case might not realize is that she was missing for 5 whole days before her remains were discovered. Well, where was she for these 5 days? Was she with Marvin Margolis in the Zodiac Motel? If that's the case, his wife didn't say anything about that. His wife didn't say that he was missing for 5 days. Was she being held and tortured somewhere by Marvin Margolis? Well, his wife didn't say anything about him being gone or at the Zodiac Motel. And interrogations were a lot tougher in the 1940s. From what I hear, I don't have a time machine. I'm not H.G. Wells, but if I were, I would probably confirm that they were a lot tougher in the 1940s. So that alone casts a little bit of doubt. Of course, that doesn't exonerate him in the Black Dahlia case, but that casts doubt, and I'm just kind of done with that, so I'll turn it back to you guys.
When it comes to a DNA standpoint, we've seen the hoop jumping in the Zodiac case, the back and forth, what they have, what don't they have, is it legit, is it not? Does it link to somebody that can't be Zodiac? We've seen that. We don't have anything official from the police. We've seen in the Sherry Joe Bates case, for example, someone that whose DNA was linked to one of the letters that proved to not be involved in the murder at all. So, and then you have the Dahlia case where obviously they didn't know about DNA back then. They didn't know about it at the time of the Zodiac either. So would they have handled everything properly? Would it have been stored properly? Can they even do anything with the DNA that they might have in the in the case? I think all of that remains to be seen. Um, and until we hear something official from investigators, I think both cases are sort of in limbo as they could be connected to each other. With this guy Alex's claims, I don't think as long as nothing can be ruled out, his story lives on. His his claims will live on because until the cases are solved, he can just keep saying anything he wants to say. He can just keep on pushing whatever snake oil he wants to sell, and until he's proven wrong, he's just going to keep on doing it. And that's my opinion that he's going to try and extend this as long as he can.
But Morph, to answer that question, in the Black Dahlia case, did they handle things with precautions and like did they take like care of the evidence? I highly doubt it, based on what we saw from the Zodiac case 20 years later, when you
Exactly.
have the investigators handling items with their bare hands. Anybody can get on Google Images and just see people touching all the Zodiac evidence without gloves. And furthermore, the first letter that was mailed in the Black Dahlia case was treated with gasoline or kerosene, some type of flammable substance. And we don't know exactly which one to this day, but they believe that the killer was trying to keep all of his fingerprints off, or he's trying to do something to contaminate the evidence. So it was treated with gasoline and kerosene, and then that just kind of fooled them.
Yeah, and I mean, whoever the Black Dahlia killer was, they might have taken precautions to protect being discovered, but they didn't know about DNA because DNA wasn't a thing back then. They couldn't have known about that. So even if they were trying to maybe keep their fingerprints off something, there's a possibility that they left DNA someplace. But then again, how was it handled? How was it stored? Was there cross contamination with investigators holding the items and getting their DNA all over it? I mean, I don't see the Black Dahlia case likely being solved ever by DNA, and even the Zodiac case may not ever be solved with DNA. So I think, unfortunately, as long as these cases go unsolved, it keeps the Alex Babers of the world, you know, keep continuing to search for their 15 minutes of fame, make wild claims, and not ever have to back them up, and the case remains open. Um, and I think along those lines, we probably have to wind down and wrap up. I just want to see if you guys have any closing thoughts on what we talked about today.
Yeah, this story has been quite a headache for months now. I started looking into this in depth in December, when the story came out, and was originally not intending to spend so much time on it. But the more I looked at it, the more real problems I discovered and upsetting things about this guy. And I wanted to make sure that all my information was right before reporting on it, and I did. And to the best of my knowledge, the information is right. And I have plenty of evidence of all the things that I'm saying in the videos. The code breaking claims and the evidence claims, they, to me, now seem kind of secondary to the core question of, can we trust Alex Baber as an amateur investigator? Like, he wants all of the benefits of being an investigator without all of the responsibility. You have to be a trustworthy person to be out there as a detective, out as an investigator. You want to help out with a crime investigation. You need to get people to trust you and give you information, and you need to be able to talk to witnesses and deal with the victim's family members. And if you can't even pass a simple background check because you're evading your employment history because of all these people who fired you or people who you stole money from, obviously that's going to create issues. So the, you asked about impressions of this guy, speculations, and my impression of him is that he behaves as an addict, and he's always chasing the next thing, and he has all these problems in his past that always catch up to him. For example, his financial issues, and people with a lot of financial issues are desperate to figure out a way to deal with them. And based on the stories I've heard about people he's dealt with, he'll find any way he can to get that money from someone. And that seems to be playing out with his quests to get these documentaries made, because he likes to say he's not getting any money from victims' families. But what about getting wined and dined by these production companies that are, interested in his story? So, he may still be trying to work those angles. So everybody just needs to be aware of this guy and what he's trying to do. And people that are unfamiliar with him are going to fall for his persuasive tactics, like Ned was talking about.
Yeah, and it's in this case, there's a lot of people that, like you and I, that know the Zodiac case very well. We know what's true, what's not true. We know, when somebody comes along and makes wild claims and stuff, we know the difference between truth and fiction. But to the general public that doesn't really follow the Zodiac case all that well, or the Black Dahlia case for that matter, they see this in a quick headline in whatever news outlet it is, and they're like, "Oh, well, this is interesting. The Zodiac case is finally solved. Wow, very cool." Without doing the work that you did, to or anyone else putting it out there for the most part, to say, "Hey, this is not solved, and this case is ongoing."
I actually have a final thought that is mostly a question for David. And for Dave, because we have the opportunity to talk with you, there have been a lot of people who are claiming that your solution to the 340 cipher is incorrect. And I was given the task of making a prediction about what will happen in the Zodiac Killer mystery for this current year, 2026. And my response was, that there are going to be more and more people claiming that they've solved the 340 cipher. And it's not like I had some brilliant insight. It's just that at the end of 2025, there were a lot of posts online where people are like, look, I've actually solved the 340. I have the real solution. Just 2 days ago, somebody wrote to me at my email address, blackboxonlineradio@aol.com, and they were like, Ned, you just wait. I've been hearing what you're saying about the 340. You just wait. I'm going to reveal the true solution. What is this true solution? I don't know. They haven't shared it yet, but they're going to. Oh, they're going to. And I've noticed that there has been an influx of people claiming that they have the true solution to the 340. But we have a chance to ask Dave directly, what is your response to all of these people who say that your solution was incorrect and they know the truth?
Well, I'm pretty sure we got the right solution, first of all. It also depends on what you mean by incorrect. Like some people will say that it's incorrect only because it's not complete, meaning that there's some secondary meaning. Like they'll accept that we found the correct plain text, but there's some other underlying meaning there that has not been teased out. Like there's some unanswered questions about it. Like, do the misspellings in the plain text signify anything, like another layer of a message, a steganographic message, like he hid another layer of information in there. And of course, that's possible. It's just a matter of what are the techniques for getting that out and to prove that it was there by design and it's not just some noise that's being colored in by some theory. But to say that the whole thing is wrong flies in the face of the evidence that it's correct, which is outlined in a paper um, that someone wrote about the unicity distance, which is a cryptography term referring to how long a cipher has to be before a uniquely found plaintext can be guaranteed to be the correct one, the only correct one. And the paper shows that those conditions have been met to demonstrate that our solution is the right one. Another way to look at it is if you consider the key for the 340 cipher, it's only 60 odd symbols, 63 symbols. And that combined with the transposition scheme mean that there's a very limited number of things you can do to force a message to come out of it. You can either get the correct message to come out of it, or you can get kind of like pseudo messages that aren't real to come out of it. But none of the pseudo messages even come close to resembling human readable text. And that's why the solution that we found is the correct one, because the math also shows that it would be virtually impossible to find an alternative solution, using the decryption steps that we made. But I would encourage everyone to keep looking for those secondary messages if they're in there, because it's very possible he did something weird like that. For instance, with the Z408, we still don't have a full explanation for the remaining, the final 18 symbols there. They're still considered gibberish, but is it filler? Is there a hidden message? We don't really know for sure.
Well, I'm really glad to hear that from you about the secondary solutions because I was actually going to ask you directly. And I'm glad to hear it because I'm not opposed to secondary solutions either. I look for some of them. And I would also like to know what you think about this, and that is, did the Zodiac killer have a very, very high understanding of codes? Because I'm tempted to think that he did. He was able to create the 340 solution and have common English words present in the cipher text, like on the grid. It begins with her and what appears to be God at the start. And then we have the minus signs on the side and the plus sign in the middle. And we have the word that resembles Zodiac at the end. It doesn't say Zodiac, right? It's the Z with the triangles, IAK. And when I look at that, I just begin to think this person really knew how to arrange the cipher symbols to generate a coherent message, which you decoded, but also to have English words in some very, very obvious places. So I would just like to ask, do you think that we need to be looking for a suspect that had a very high understanding of cryptography?
I think that's a piece of his personality. It's hard to gauge, how much knowledge he had, but I would I would be inclined to say that it was above average for, typically people they know enough, like people that are interested in cryptograms as just pastimes. They'll learn how to do them in the newspapers when they were published in newspapers at the time. They know enough to deal with simple substitution ciphers, but they don't know to make homophonic substitutions with so many different symbols, and they don't know how to split up a ciphertext into this weird transposition scheme. The impression I get from Zodiac, looking at his letters and his history, is that he's a very creative individual who gets a lot of inspiration from a variety of pop culture sources. So I would think that he's kind of gleaning knowledge from the pop culture elements that he's consuming, that he references all the time in his letters. The Most Dangerous Game, The Exorcist, The Mikado, and so forth. So he has the kind of this. I would think that he's like a curious and creative person because he has all this kind of esoteric knowledge that he sprinkles onto everything. So I think he probably approached cryptography the same way. Like he had a curiosity about it and developed his own knowledge around it and implemented it in his own weird, unique way that we don't really see from anyone else.
And that's just touching the tip of the iceberg. I mean, again, just a reminder for listeners, go over and check out Dave's YouTube videos on Zodiac ciphers and a lot of other kinds of ciphers. He's put a lot of thought and a lot of time into, the case and the ciphers that he covers on this channel. And just once again, Dave, let people know where they can find you and your work.
So just Google for David Aranchak on YouTube, or just look for David Aranchak Zodiac ciphers, or Let's Crack Zodiac is the name of the Zodiac cipher series. But that's like the best way to get to my content.
And Ned, let people know where they can find you again.
Yes, you can get me on YouTube under the name Black Box Online Radio. Every Monday I make an episode about the Zodiac Killer for my Zodiac Monday segment. I'm also the admin of a Facebook group called the Zodiac Killer Library. If people want to join a Facebook group, they can join the Zodiac Killer Library. And I'm available for contact at blackboxonlineradio@aol.com. And Morph, thank you for inviting me to join you. And David, thank you for also answering our questions.
And thanks you guys for having me. And it was great talking to you.
Yeah, and it's been a really fascinating and enlightening conversation. And again, thank you both for being here to help us push back on this nonsense. I think it's just the beginning, though, because we're going to have multiple episodes coming out exposing Alex Baber's nonsense, and we're going to have more experts to help us do that. Usually this show releases episodes every other weekend, but I'm going to try and get these episodes out on a weekly basis going forward until we conclude this multi-parter on Alex Baber's claims and his nonsense. So everyone be sure to tune in next Saturday too for another episode. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining us for this episode of Zodiac Speaking. If you'd like to help more people find the show, please take a moment to rate and review us on the podcast platform you're listening now on, and make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss any new episodes. Just a reminder, new episodes of Zodiac Speaking will air on Saturdays. To support this show, please consider an AbJack Insider subscription through Apple Podcast. For only $4.99 a month or $49.99 a year, you'll get not only ad-free early access and bonus content for this show, but for every show on the AbJack network of podcasts. Just head over to Apple Podcasts to get started with a free trial. If you want to follow or interact with us on social media, we're on every major platform. Simply search for Zodiac Speaking Podcast on your favorites. You can also find our homepage at zodiacspeaking.com. This is Mike Morford, and I'd like to say thanks again for listening, and we'll see you on the next episode of Zodiac Speaking.